Hi guys, welcome to another exciting video on Java. In the last video we talked about some very important principles, OOP principles, that is object oriented programming principles. We talked about something called as encapsulation, we spoke about something called as inheritance and polymorphism. Today we're going to talk a few more topics in the first unit, guys. So we're going to talk about very important topics such as how to execute your Java program, what are the steps involved in executing your Java program. Next, we're going to talk about something called as JIT, what do you mean by JIT, JVM, JRE and so on. So I will see you on the other side, guys. Stay tuned. So we're going to talk about the steps that are involved in how to execute a Java program, the steps which are involved in executing a Java program. Next, we're going to talk about what is a JIT, that is just-in-time compiler. Next, we're going to talk about what is called as JVM, Java Virtual Machine, right? JRE, Java Runtime Environment, right? And we're going to talk about JDK, Java Development Kit. Next, after that, we're going to talk about some naming convention for your Java program, how you should name your Java programs. Next, we're going to see a couple of programs on Java, how to compile and run those programs. So we'll get to the topic right away, guys. Okay, so this is the first topic we're going to talk about today, guys. The different steps that are involved in Java program. This is very important because in the interviews they will ask you like what are the different steps whenever you run a Java program, what are the different steps involved, and these are some very important points we have to talk about today. So initially you already know from whatever we have already learnt in the first unit that normally whatever code you have written in Java is called as a source code, right? That source code is nothing but is also called as a high level language. Now remember, we are trying to convert your high level language into something called as a machine level language which your machine understands. Your Java is not understood by your machine, or your processor does not understand what is Java. Your processor only understands zeros and ones, or they are binary numbers. So basically, either if it is high signal, the bit will be 1, if the signal is low, the bit will be 0 and so on. So remember, whenever we want to run a Java program, the Java program has to be converted from its high level language into a low level language first. Now, one very important thing that you would not have seen in your previous languages like C and C++, in C normally there is a compiler which you can directly use to compile the C program, that is a high level language, into a low level language, right? A machine dependent language. Same with your C++, but it is a little different with your Java, guys. Now, your Java compiler will compile your program, your high level language, whatever you have written, the Java code that you have written, into something called as a byte code, or it is also called as an intermediate code. Okay, it is not the low level language, it is called as an intermediate code. Your source code, the Java program that you write, will be converted into something called as an intermediate language or intermediate code called as byte code. This byte code in turn will be converted to a low level language based on the different operating system that we have. So this JVM, we have something called as Java Virtual Machine. This Java Virtual Machine is the software basically built for each operating system. We have different Java virtual machines, right? These Java virtual machines are the softwares which convert your byte code or your intermediate code into something called as a machine dependent code or your low level language, binary code, right? So remember, your Java compiler does not compile your program, your source code, directly from a high level to a low level language. This is the main reason we have something called as a portability, and if you write it once, you can run it anywhere. This concept that is there in Java is because of this. That is, your source code is not directly converted to a low level language. Your source code is converted to a byte code. This byte code can be run on any machine. You can run it on a Linux machine, you can run it on a Windows machine, you can run it on a Mac machine, you can run it on a Unix machine, any type of operating system you can run it on, because your Oracle has made JVMs for different operating systems. So your JVMs are operating system dependent. Each operating system will have a specific JVM made for it. You cannot have, there is no a single JVM for all the operating systems, right? So each operating system will have its own specific JVM. Now the job of this JVM is to convert your bytecode into something called as a machine dependent code or a low level language or a binary number. So these are the different steps involved whenever you talk about a Java program execution, guys. This is a very important concept from exam point of view as well as your interview. They will ask you questions related to this. So we will move on to the next topic, guys. Alright, so next we're going to talk about something called as JIT, just-in-time compiler. So what do you mean by just-in-time compiler? This is a very new concept, guys. It was not there in your C language or C++ language, but it is very, very powerful to make your Java program very efficient. Okay, if you want to make your program, Java programs efficient, this JIT is the concept that is very important in Java. Right? So JIT basically stands for just-in-time compiler. So please listen very carefully what I am telling because it's important. Many people, many students do not know about this topic because normally this is not covered in depth in your syllabus. So I will tell you what exactly it means. So it's very important. So please listen. So just-in-time compiler is part of your JVM. So when you talk about your Java virtual machine, it is part of your Java virtual machine, guys. So what happens is this JIT or your just-in-time compiler, what happens is normally your Java code, your source code will be converted to a high-level language to a bytecode. That bytecode again needs to be converted to something called as a low-level language, the job of which is done by JVM. Now, JVM will not directly convert whatever classes are there in your program which have been converted into bytecode. It will not convert, the JVM will not convert all the classes into the low level language or machine dependent code directly. What it will do is, as part of a JVM, this JIT, we have something called as a just-in-time compiler, right? So what it basically does is, this JVM maintains a call count. How many times a particular function or the class is being called, right? How many times are you using that particular function within the class? The call count is maintained. Okay, so JVM maintains that call count, guys. And JIT or your just-in-time compiler will have a compilation threshold value. Okay, your JIT, just-in-time compiler, which is part of your JVM, will have a value called as compilation threshold. That means, for example, I am calling a particular function 10 times in my program. Now in that case, because that function has been used so many times, you are calling that same function so many times, normally that particular function will be compiled from your bytecode into machine dependent code. But if you have a function in your program which is not called at all, it is there in your program, it may be used in your program sometime, but that function is not being called too many times. So basically you may have called only once, right? In that case, the JVM will not compile that particular function or the class into its equivalent dependent machine dependent code. Okay, the JIT will define a compilation threshold. That means if that function is called at least 3 times, for example, if the compilation threshold is 3, if that function is called at least 3 times, then that function which is defined will be compiled into from bytecode into something called as a machine dependent code. Until then, it will not be compiled into machine dependent code. It will only be interpreted. Okay, this is very important concept, guys. Your Java program uses an interpreter as well as a compiler. It does not only use a compiler. It's an important concept. This will be asked in your interviews, guys. Your Java programs are compiled as well as interpreted. Compiled, how is it compiled? It is compiled from the high level language into bytecode, and that bytecode will be initially interpreted. That means it is not compiling into a machine dependent code. It is initially interpreted. Once that call count of that function exceeds the compilation threshold of the JIT, that is when that function will be converted into machine dependent code. And this is the reason why your Java programs are very, very efficient, guys. They run efficiently because of this particular concept, because you are not compiling the complete code initially into machine dependent code. You are only compiling parts of the code which are used the most into the machine dependent code, and the rest of the code which is not used for the execution, even though it is there, it may be used later, it will not be compiled into the machine dependent code initially. It will be interpreted and then it will be compiled. So your Java program, both it will interpret as well as compile. If the question is asked in interviews, does Java program is only compiler used? No, your interpreter as well as compiler both are used, guys. So you can see on the slide, you can read off whatever is there on the slide. I have exactly explained whatever is there on the slide, guys. So you can see the second point, often used methods are compiled soon after the JVM has started, and less used methods are compiled much later or not at all. So if the method call count does not exceed the threshold value, then it will never be compiled into the machine dependent code. Okay, normally in your Java program we have something called as main function. So your main function will always be compiled initially, because from that main function only we will be calling the other functions, right? So your main function initially will be compiled into the machine dependent code. From there, from the main function, whichever functions you are being used or you are calling so many number of times, those functions which cross or exceed the JIT compilation threshold, those functions will be compiled into machine dependent code. So a very important concept. We will move on to the next topic, guys. Alright, so next we're going to look at 3 more topics, guys. Something called as JVM, JRE and JDK. Very important, guys, very important in interviews. So what is a JVM? Java Virtual Machine. I just now told you that JVM is responsible for converting your bytecode into a machine dependent code. But very important, listen carefully. JVM contains only the specification of how to do it. It will not do it by itself. JVM will use something called as JRE, that is Java Runtime Environment, which actually converts the bytecode into machine dependent code. JVM is responsible, it contains only the specification. You can read it on the slide. It gives an abstract specification of how the Java bytecode will be interpreted and executed. It is only a specification. It is not the one which is actually converting the bytecode into machine dependent code. We actually have something called as JRE, or Java Runtime Environment, which actually implements whatever JVM is specifying, right? So basically it will convert the bytecode into the machine dependent code. It consists of different libraries and APIs, your application programming interfaces, which are required to execute your code. So JRE is responsible for that, guys. Next, finally, we have something called as JDK. What is JDK? Now, whenever you want to execute a Java program, you should have installed a Java development kit. That is what JDK means. So whenever you want to execute a Java program, then you should have installed a JDK. JDK will contain your JVM as well as JRE. These two are required for you to run any Java program. So if you want to execute a Java program, you need to install either a JDK, Java development kit, okay, or you can use a IDE such as Eclipse, right, or NetBeans. There are so many IDEs out there nowadays, but the most popular out there is either your Eclipse or NetBeans. They are very powerful IDEs, or integrated development environments, right? So in that IDE such as Eclipse, this JDK is already inbuilt. Your JRE, JVM will already be there. So you do not have to separately install a JDK. But if you do not have an IDE such as Eclipse or NetBeans, then you have to go on Google search for the latest JDK on the Java Oracle website and install that JDK. Once you install the JDK, then you can set the path in the environment variables and you can start executing the program in your command prompt. Right? Normally people do not execute their programs nowadays on command prompt. You will normally use an IDE which is much more easier and faster for execution. Right? So this is what a JVM, JRE and JDK means. We'll move on to the next one, guys. Alright, next we're going to look at something called as naming conventions. So remember, naming conventions are very, very important. So remember, whenever you want to save a Java program, you have to use an extension called .java, right? Just like when you save a text file, you use .txt. Whenever you want to save an image, .jpg, and so on, right? So similarly, whenever you want to save a Java program, make sure in front of the name .java extension is given. That is when it is recognized as a Java program, guys. So if you do not give the extension, it will not be recognized as a Java program. So make sure you use the extension. Now whenever you are naming your Java file, make sure the class name which contains your main function. Now many people get confused, so listen very carefully. Whenever you write a Java program, you already know that it contains a class. Within a class you have a main function, right? So remember, whichever class has the main function, that class name should be the file name. Okay, you may have multiple classes in your Java program, right? You may have so many classes which do not have main function, but whenever you are naming your Java program, make sure that whichever class contains the main function, that class name should be your file name. Okay, that is very important. And next thing is, make sure your file names start with capital letters. That's a naming convention, guys. Normally in any company, wherever you go, whichever company you join, normally whenever you save a program or you have a class name in Java, it will always, remember, class names always start with a capital letter. Your methods, your functions start with small letters, right? If you have multiple words in methods, the second word after the second word, after the first word, the second word and so on will have first letter of each word will have a capital letter. That is the naming convention for method. But when you talk about a class name and you have multiple words in a class name, each word first letter should be capitalized. That is the naming convention by default. So make sure you know this naming convention in Java. Whenever you write a class name, the class name should start with a capital letter. If you have multiple words in a class, make sure each word, the first letter should be capital, right? So this is the naming convention for your Java programs. Make sure you know this. So we will move on to the next one. That is, we're going to see a program, guys. Alright, before we see a program, we need to know how to compile your program. So we'll go through how to compile it first. So what you have to do is, if you do not have an Eclipse or a NetBeans IDE, you can open a notepad, write the Java program that you want to write, save it as some name.java, right? And then what you have to do is, you have to basically compile the program first. So what you have to do is, before compiling the program, you have to set the environment variables, right? In your settings, there is something called as environment variables. In that environment variables, you have to set the path of your JDK folder. I will make another video on how to do that, but make sure you set the path. That means whenever you run a Java program in your command prompt, it will access that JDK folder which you have installed, right? From there only it will be able to compile or run your programs, right? So make sure you know that you set the environment variables. So you can see here, whenever you want to compile the program, you can go to the command prompt. You can go to the folder where you have saved your Java program, that is your name, whatever whatever file name .java. Okay, so you can go to that particular folder, and when you want to compile it, you have to use the keyword called javac. Okay, you have to write javac space the file name .java. That is how you compile the program. Javac space file name .java, whichever file you have created, right? So this is how you basically compile the program. Remember, when you compile this program, it compiles your high level Java source code into a byte code, not a machine dependent code, right? So that is how you compile a program, guys, and make sure that the names that you use are exactly same, the capital letters and small letters, because Java program is case sensitive. It is not like your HTML programs that you use in your web technologies where it is not case sensitive. Here Java programs, everything that you declare in Java is case sensitive. So be careful whenever you use small letters, you mention small letters, or if you use capital letters, you use capital letters. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one, guys. So when you want to run a Java program, that is the next step, guys. Whenever you want to run a Java program, it's the same exact thing that you have done in the previous slide, that is your Java for compilation, but the only thing is the keyword has changed from Java C to Java. Okay, the keyword that you have to use for executing your program is just write Java space file name, and for the file name don't give the extension in this case, right? Whenever you are executing your Java program, just write the keyword Java space file name without the extension. That is how you can execute a Java program, guys. So remember, whatever program you have written initially, your .java file will be converted into something called as a bytecode. That bytecode will be in terms of a .class file extension. That .class file bytecode which has been converted by your compiler, Java compiler, has to be converted to a machine dependent code which your JVM will do, right? So this is how you basically execute your program in Java, guys. We'll see a simple program on how a Java program looks like now. Alright, so please look at this very simple program that I have displayed on the screen. It's a very simple Java program. It's I mean, it's a very normally people will write hello world as their first program, but I have written there as this is a simple Java program, right? So anyways, this is a program that's very important, very easy to understand also, but this is your first program in Java, so listen carefully. Now when we talk about it, remember the first part, if you can see the code, there is a slash, there is a forward slash and a star, and in that it is written as this is a simple Java program, call this file example.java, and then after that next line there is a star and a forward slash again. So remember, whatever I have written, the first 4 lines what I have written there are called as comments. Okay, they are called as comments. Your Java program will not compile those comments into machine dependent code because they are just like notes. Now normally whenever you write anything, you create note in the bottom. After you create a slide, some important point is there, you will write a note there. Similarly, normally you create comments. So when you start developing programs in companies, a developer will normally comment his or her programs heavily. So if a next person comes to his position later, right, and that person has to understand what that program is, then commenting will help him understand that particular program. So each line can be commented. In this case, you can write initially on the top of the at the top of your program, you can normally write what the program is doing, right? You can define what the program is doing in that comment so that the person understand what that program is doing, right? Or you can also comment each and every line in your code. So if a next person comes to your position and sees what you have written, that comments that you have written in every line will help him understand what you are exactly doing with the code. And normally this convention is followed in most of the companies. It is heavily commented, right? And it is also easy. Whenever you comment your programs, it is easier to debug also. It helps in debugging also, guys. Next, we have written there as class example. Remember, everything in your Java is written in classes. You cannot write your functions outside a class. Everything has to be written within a class, right? You are talking about classes, objects and methods, right? That is how it follows. So remember, whenever you want to declare a class, you have to write the keyword class space the name of your class. Your class name always, remember I told you by naming convention, you should start, the word should start with a capital letter. You can use small letters, but by naming convention, it should always start with capital letters, right? It's not an error, fine, if you use a small letter. But anyways, so I have declared in this particular program called as example, that is the name of my class. Okay, within that example class, I have commented in the first line, you can see 2 forward slashes is called as a single line comment. What you saw in the top of the program is called as a multi-line comment. Whatever you see inside the class example, that 2 forward slash and there is a sentence, it says your program begins with a call to main. That line is a comment. It's a single line comment, guys. So that line which is there after 2 forward slashes will not be compiled or it will not be executed. It is just a comment. Okay. So it already tells you what it does. So remember, whenever you run a Java program, the first method that is executed in your program is your main function, right? So that is the reason, remember, when you are naming your file, the file name should be the same name as the class which contains the main function, right? So it will search whatever file name you have given. In that file name's class, it will try to search for a main function. If it does not find a main function, it will basically say that class not found exception, right? So that is the error you will get. So make sure the file name and the class name which contains the main function is the same, right? Next, you can see there we have a main function declared in that class example. It says public static void main. The name of your function is main. Remember, your function names will never start with a capital letter, only your class names, right? So what does a public mean? I will make a separate video of what all these things means, right? Public is basically something called as an access specifier. Who all in your code can access, which classes in your code or in your project can access that particular function is what that public will tell. Public, there are different modifiers. We have something called as a default modifier, public modifier, private modifier, right? And protected modifier. These are the four main modifiers that can be used. They are called as access modifiers which can be used. Public means all the classes have an access to that particular function. Then we have static. Now static is a keyword which is basically used to tell that the space for that function is allocated at the compile time itself. Okay, the space for that main function will be allocated at the compile time itself. Normally the space will be allocated for the functions at the runtime, right? We have two things, two main categories, compile time and runtime. So whenever you run a program, whenever you compile a program, there are some certain spaces that can be allocated when you have compiled the program. So if you have declared the function as static, the space will be allocated for that function at the compile time itself. If you don't declare it as static, then it will be allocated at the runtime. But remember, main function will always be declared as static, because remember, the space has to be allocated for the main function during the compile time only, right? So make sure that static is always used for your main function. And one more very important thing about static is, normally whenever you want to access a function within a particular class, you will create an object for that class. Using the object for that class, I can access a particular function, right? Now, when you have declared that function in that particular class as a static function, then it means that for that class, I do not have to create an object to access that function. I will directly write the class name dot the function name to access that particular function within that class. That is one more important point about using a static keyword, guys, right? Next, we have something called as void there. Void basically means it talks about the return type. Whenever you return some value to a function, then you can return an integer value. You already know some primitive data types that you have already learned in C++, such as int, char, float, string. These are different primitive data types that are there in your Java program also. We will talk about that a little later, right? So you can return that type of value. If you want to return an integer value, instead of void, I will write there as int main. If I want to return a character value to the function, then I would write char there, right? In this case, main function will never return any value. So normally you will write void. Void means null. That means no value, right? In the main function, I have written string space args. That args is nothing but your array. It's a string array, guys, right? That args with the 2 square brackets is nothing but a string array, which is normally used for taking inputs from your command prompt directly. Okay, they are used for taking command line inputs, or basically when you try to run a Java program in your command prompt, in the command prompt before the execution of the program, there only you can give your input values. In that case, when you want to take the input values in the command prompt itself, or command line inputs you want to take, then you can use that args array in your program. We will see that a little later. So you can see here, whenever you want to print a particular line in C and C++, in C we use something called as println function to print your whatever you wanted to print, right? If you wanted to print in your C++, you use cout, right? Whenever you want to print something in Java, you have three things you have to mention. You have to use something called as system.out.println. Now, system is nothing but your package, okay, or your class. A system is nothing but a class under which you have a word defined called as out, okay, under which there is a function called as println. Inside the class we have a function called as println. Inside that we are passing in the double quotes the parameter that we want to print. So in this case, whatever you write in that println in the double quotes will get printed on the screen and on the output screen, right? So this is a simple Java program. In this case, will get printed on the output screen. So this is a very simple Java program. How a Java program looks like, guys. We will continue with more topics in the next videos. I hope you have understood and liked the video. If you have any questions, you can definitely ping me, you can email me. I will put the email in the description also, and I will share these PPTs what I have gone through in this video. So please share and like this video. Thank you. See you back in the next video.